Welcome to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Rosensweet, mom of 3 young people, peaceful parenting coach, and your cheerleader and guide on all things parenting. Each week, we'll cover the tools, strategies, and support you need to end the yelling and power struggles and encourage your kids to listen and cooperate so that you can enjoy your family time. I'm happy to say we have a great relationship with our 3 kids. The teen years have been easy and joyful, not because we're special unicorns, but because my kids were raised with peaceful parenting. I've also helped so many parents just like you stop struggling and enjoy their kids again. I'm excited to be here with you today and bring you the insight and information you need to make your parenting journey a little more peaceful. Let's dive into this week's conversation. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. Today I am so excited to have with me 2 wonderful guests. We've got a 2-for-1 this episode. They are Rachel Harrington and Jessica Hill, and they are both certified occupational therapy assistants, and they are here to talk to us about all things sensory. In fact, that's the name of their own podcast. I had such a great conversation with them, and I came away with so many ahas in terms of supporting our sensory kids. If you don't know what I mean by that, you're definitely going to want to check it out. If you do know what I mean by that, you're definitely going to want to check it out, because so often when we have a kiddo, a complex kiddo, the sensory piece is a big part of that. And if you like what you hear, you're definitely going to want to make sure that you check out my coming up Flourish with Your Complex Child Summit, because Rachel and Jessica are 2 of our guest interviewees for that free summit that's coming up. And that's at sararosensweet.com/summit. If the summit is already passed, if you're listening to this past mid-October, still check it out, because you do have a chance to still access the summit recordings after the fact. But we put together this summit because so many of you with kids who have those kids who are more or extra, we want to support you, because there's not a lot out there in the general peaceful parenting world for our 20% kids, right? You hear me talk about those 20% kids who are they're more challenging to parent. Even if they're really amazing and wonderful, we've got to be so much more intentional. And Rachel and Jessica shared so many great strategies in both this podcast and also in the upcoming summit interview that you're definitely going to want to have a listen today. And if you like what you hear, hop on over to sararosensweet.com/summit and check it out. And one of the things I loved about this interview today that you're going to hear with Rachel and Jessica is there's so many overlaps and things that we suggest here in our community that they suggest also. We had so many simpatico things, and they're doing it from a sensory perspective. So I just love that. They had so many great ideas for you. So have a listen, and hopefully you can sign up to listen to them again in our summit, and tell a friend, bring a friend to the summit. It's totally free, and it's really, really good, if I do say so myself. I've been working on this for months behind the scene, bringing together all of these amazing experts from around the world. So check us out at sararosensweet.com/summit, and let's meet Rachel and Jessica. Hello, Rachel and Jessica. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Hello.
I don't know if I've ever had 2 guests before. This might be a new thing.
It's always better than one.
Yeah, especially you 2. I was on your podcast, which by the time this hits the airwaves, it will be released. So we'll put a link to that in our show notes. And it was so much fun talking to you. I just said I feel like I'm meeting up with 2 old friends here. So yeah. Welcome to my podcast. So tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Okay, I'll go first. I'm Rachel Harrington. I'm a certified occupational therapy assistant with my autism certificate, and I am one half of the podcast duo here with Jessica. We podcast and create courses and share information on all things sensory. We spread the word. Yeah, in a nutshell, that's me.
Well, and you're a mother.
Oh, like deep. Yes, I am.
A little bit.
If you really want to know, I have 2 young kids, a 2.5-year-old and a 1-year-old, and a dog and a husband. There you go. And
that explains everything.
Exactly. That's the reason I am why I am the way that I am.
All right, great. Well, welcome. And Jessica, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yep. So I'm Jessica. I'm also a certified occupational therapy assistant. And Rachel and I actually went to school together and then worked together in an outpatient pediatric clinic for many years, actually, before we started the podcast and all the digital content that we do now. But I currently work 2 days a week in an outpatient pediatric clinic, practicing occupational therapy, which, I took a break from practicing for a couple of years, but just recently got back into it, which has been super fun. And then I am a mother to a 9-year-old boy. And even though he's a little bit older than Rachel's and there's only one of him, he's still pretty crazy and wild. So,
He's one of those extra or more kids.
Oh, yeah, he has big emotions.
All right. Well, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. And, other than just enjoying talking to you, part of the reason why I invited you on the podcast was because I hear so much in my community and with my clients that like we're doing all the things, like we're doing all the peaceful parenting things, and we're still having a hard time. Like we're still having like a lot of trouble at transitions or meltdowns, or, they won't brush their teeth, or, just whatever. And so then I often start looking at like, well, are there maybe any sensory things going on? So I think that's going to be like that's like the frame of our conversation, is to educate parents about what sensory processing disorder is and how to spot it and what they can do if they think that their child might have some sensory challenges going on. So maybe we could start by you just give us a little lowdown on what sensory processing disorder is.
Yeah, sensory processing disorder is kind of a big umbrella term with sensory modulation, sensory discrimination challenges, and postural disorders. But really, what it comes down to is allowing the child, the person, to have an adaptive response or to have an appropriate response to the sensory input that's coming into their body. So we think about sounds, and I'll use this as an example throughout because this is my sensory quirk and this is what I struggle with. But being able to process and modulate competing sounds. So when a kiddo's crying, when the TV's on too loud, when the car radio's too loud, and someone's trying to talk to me, it almost sends me into fight or flight because I'm having a hard time having that appropriate response to all of that auditory input simultaneously. So you have 8 senses, and that is important to be able to have an appropriate response to each of those senses. And Jess, maybe you can explain kind of
Well,
like
let me just break in real quick here because I want to highlight 2 things you just said. One is that it almost sends you into a fight or flight. And for some kids, it does send them into fight or flight,
Yes.
right? Because they don't
Yep.
have like the maturity of or perspective or awareness of what's going on. And
Yes.
so I think just for our listeners, anytime we sense something that's a threat or danger, that's what sends us into fight or flight. So for you, competing noises, your nervous system is interpreting that as a threat, right?
Yes.
So that's why it's hard to deal with. So it's like things that are coming in from the environment or from inside somebody's body that they're, can I say, like wrongly attributing that as a threat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
And then the other thing I wanted to highlight what you said is that we have 8 senses, because in school we're always taught we have 5 senses, right? So
Yes.
what are the other 3? I mean, we have the 5 everyone learns in school: taste, touch, smell, sight, and hearing, right?
Yeah.
What are the other 3 senses?
So the 3 hidden senses I always think are actually more important than those other ones sometimes because they affect us.
They're like the near senses.
They're the near
Yeah,
senses because they're in our body. So the first one is vestibular, and we have receptors in our inner ear canal. And anytime our head position changes, it activates our vestibular system. So when you get dizzy from spinning, when you feel that drop in your stomach when you go down the roller coaster, anytime you turn your head to look another direction, that's activating your vestibular system. And it helps you understand where your body is in space. It helps you keep your balance, and it's directly related to your visual system. The next one is the proprioceptive sense. And you have receptors in your joints and your muscles that when you move, those receptors tell your body where you are, what you're doing, and how much force to use. The other side of proprioception is related to your tactile system. So anytime you receive deep pressure, like a hug or a massage, that's a combination of tactile and proprioceptive input, and it's all calming to your nervous system. So proprioception helps you to not only understand your body, but feel more calm. So kids who are in that fight or flight state, proprioception is what we typically use to help them feel more calm. And then the third one is interoception. And this is your ability to understand all of the inner workings of your body. So, understanding hunger and thirst, understanding when you need to use the bathroom, understanding temperature and regulating your temperature, even going as far as like heart rate and being able to regulate your breathing and your heart rate, and then also your emotional awareness. So, those are the three hidden senses. And really, they're all related. All 8 of them are related. So then if we go back to sensory processing disorder, if a child isn't processing information in one of their 8 senses, it's also going to affect other senses as well. It's never just one.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of the processing bit, can it also be that some kids, like, they, to have a regulated nervous system, they need more input or less input? Like, it's not just how it's processed, but like different levels of input for sensory things?
Yes.
Yeah. And I think to just kind of piggyback on what Jessica mentioned, you have your 8 senses and you can crave certain input with some senses and you can avoid certain input with other senses. So it isn't necessarily this black and white line of I'm highly sensitive, I'm sensitive to everything. It's I could be sensitive to some things and I could crave other things. So I'm a little sensitive to auditory input, but I also crave some vestibular and I crave some proprioceptive input simultaneously. So you can crave, you can seek, you can avoid, and you can be sensitive to all of the different senses as well.
That's so interesting. When you were talking about the interoception and you mentioned like having to go to the bathroom, like I see that so much with kids who, like, they say they don't have to go, but then their behavior starts to like go downhill because they really have to go. And then as soon as they go to the bathroom, then they're feeling regulated again.
Mm-hmm.
And is it that they're just not feeling it? They're not aware of that sensation in their body. So they're saying, I don't have to pee or whatever.
It's such a good question because I think all children go through this almost phase of where they're potty trained, but they get so engaged in an activity that they don't want to leave it. Mm-hmm. So they say they don't have to go to the bathroom, right? So I've seen that. But there is the other side of it where some kids really truly don't understand what that feeling in their body means. So they feel that pressure, down in their lower abdomen, but they don't know that it means that they need to go to the bathroom, or
Right.
they maybe don't even register the feeling and they don't feel it at all because they're so under responsive to that feeling.
Right. Yeah. And I love that you made that distinction between like that being a normal part of toilet learning, that no, I don't have to go because I'm playing with my blocks.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe as they get older, if you're seeing that happening, then maybe it's more of a sensory thing.
Mm-hmm. Also, I think, we just did a podcast on strategies for the bathroom, actually. And one thing we like to take note of is using the bathroom is a full sensory experience. You walk into the bathroom and there's bright lights, and especially in public restrooms, it's very echoey and noisy. Maybe there's the hand dryer, maybe there's the automatic toilet flushing, and then there's also a smell component. So, if your child's refusing to use the bathroom, we want to take a look at the why. Is it an interoceptive challenge? Is it another sense that they're struggling with when they go into the bathroom?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, that the multi-layered experience that a lot of things are. And, from talking to parents who have sensory kids, like things like taking a bath, like exactly the same thing. Like they have to go from like warm and dressed to, I mean, maybe you could lay it out because I know there's so many steps to that thing. And some parents are like, why won't they take a bath? We do this every day or whatever.
Yeah. A big part of the bath is, again, with going to the bathroom, you've got the lights, you've got the echoes, you've got the loud sound of the water coming out of the bath, you've got the transition from dry to wet to dry again. And a big one that we see with kiddos is they're struggling to tip their head back when they're washing their hair. And that extension of the neck can also send them into fight or flight. If they're struggling with postural control, like the ability to like maintain a good trunk position, if they're struggling with vestibular processing challenges or maybe retained Moro reflexes or TLR reflexes, that can also send them into fight or flight, that extension back. So a lot of kids will just either refuse, they'll shut down, they'll have a meltdown. So baths can be really relaxing for some kiddos and really meet that sensory need because that water provides a lot of proprioceptive input, or they can be really alerting and disorganizing for the nervous system as well.
It's so interesting, isn't it? How, like,
Yes,
even within the same
it
child,
is.
yeah, like, first of all, between people, how different that experience can be. As you said, for
Yeah.
some people, it's really relaxing and gives them this input, and other people, totally disorganizing. And I want to also go back to what you were saying about how you can have I'm going to say competing sensory, like, input or avoidance. Like, I know some kids, noise dysregulates them, but when they're feeling dysregulated, they make a lot of noise to
Mhm.
regulate themselves. And parents are like, "Wait, this is this is so confusing."
Yeah, that's a good one. I think it's important to remember that when we make noise ourselves, we get a lot of vibration through our body and we get a lot of feeling in like our mouth, right? So maybe the child avoids loud noises in their environment, but they make noise themselves because they're getting more calming input to their body when they make those loud noises.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great way to help work on building the tolerance of those loud noises. If they're uncomfortable by the hand dryer or the toilet flushing, and we give them a drum set and they're in control of making that loud noise, if they're in control of flushing the toilet, if they're in control of the hand dryer, they start to learn how to have that appropriate adaptive response a little bit easier.
That's so cool. So what are some other things that maybe parents who, I mean, we've just said couple of really great ones actually, that parents maybe listening are like, "Oh, that sounds like my kid. I had no idea they were a sensory kid." But what are some other common things that you see in your practice or in your experience that parents weren't aware were sensory challenging behavior, or behavior that's challenging because of sensory challenges that you
Mhm.
see?
One that comes to mind is a kiddo who, is at school and peer bumps into them and it sends the kid into fight or flight, and maybe they're aggressive and they push the peer because that peer just barely brushed into them. We
Mhm.
want to take a deeper look and say, okay, they received maybe some unexpected tactile input which sent them into fight or flight. So we want to look at their tactile system, and are they also struggling to tolerate different clothing textures or tags on their clothing? Are they also a picky eater, or maybe they don't like to get their hands messy? And we kind of dive deep and say, okay, he's checking all the boxes and it looks like he's over responsive to tactile input. Then we can provide some strategies like some heavy work and some deep pressure and maybe a brushing protocol to start to teach his tactile system how to modulate the input better.
So I
I'd say
think what you're just referring to is a sensory diet, right?
a little bit.
Yes, yes. And then we would look into a sensory diet. Absolutely.
Yeah, so the things you're suggesting to help kids in a diet, I always think of it, it's not like what you can't eat, but it's like the recommended foods for your,
Your
blood type or
sensory
something if you're
system.
doing like the blood type diet or
Oh,
whatever.
yeah, 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 yeah.
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 Yeah, it's
And
like the sensory, the prescriptive sensory diet for your
yeah.
sensory system.
Yes, another common thing that we hear and we see is oral seeking. So a child is chewing on their shirt, chewing on their hair, chewing on their pencil, chewing on their water bottle. They're eating non-edible objects. They constantly want something in their mouth. They're either seeking that oral input or that proprioceptive input because you have those receptors in your jaw,
And tactile.
tactile input, a combination of all of them. And we'll see kiddos who are just craving oral input. And so we'll need to give them like we're going to talk about a little bit more of the sensory diet in order to meet that need. Because what you have to remember with these sensory processing challenges is that if a child is seeking this input, they're seeking it because their brain is feeling dysregulated and their brain needs more of this input in order to feel calm and organized and focused. And if we just take it away and we don't give them that input that they need and that they're craving, they're never going to learn how to process it. They're never going to learn how to have an adaptive response. They're never going to be able to focus and participate in those daily activities because their nervous system is just feeling unsettled. Like you almost like you're hungry, but you can't satisfy that hunger, right? You know that feeling?
Hmm.
That's kind of that
Hmm.
that feeling that I like to kind of connect it to. So oral seeking is a big one. Like Jessica mentioned, picky eating is kind of on the opposite side, but we can see sensory challenges with picky eating.
Talk a little bit about that. Like, what
Absolutely.
if you have a child who's a picky eater, what would make you know that it was a sensory challenge?
Well, first we want to remember that picky eating is kind of that typical childhood phase at a
Mhm.
certain age. But what happens is if there are sensory challenges or if there are actual oral motor structural challenges, maybe they have a swallowing deficit or they have low muscle tone in their
Mhm.
mouth, then it can cause picky eating to the point where they will accept a very limited number of foods. They are very inflexible in trying new foods or even eating their same food, but in a different way. So like a granola bar, they can eat it just fine. But if the granola bar is cut up or melted, they will refuse to eat it. Mm-hmm. And so that's where picky eating comes into play. And if it is a sensory challenge, we want to look at, their tactile processing. We want to look at their proprioceptive processing, even their olfactory and gustatory, which is your sense of smell and taste. We want to look and see if they're struggling to process those senses as well.
So when you do determine that that it's not just a phase of childhood, are there things that parents can do at home? I mean, I guess I kind of want to know, like, when do you think parents can kind of try some of these things, or when is it time for an OT assessment, an OT occupational therapist? And if they do think that there's a lot going on, what should parents look for in an occupational therapist? That was like 4 questions at once.
Yes. Yeah. So break it down. I think the first thing we'll talk about, if you have a picky eater, I'll use my kiddo as an example. He's 2.5. We're in the thick of that picky eating phase. We've been there for like a year. It's long. I'm exhausted, but we're coming through. The biggest thing is to work on that tactile processing and modulation. So doing messy play activities, doing food play outside of the table to get them comfortable with those textures on their hands, because research shows that a child won't tolerate a food texture in their mouth that they won't tolerate on their hands. So if you're trying to incorporate something new like oatmeal, set up a sensory bin, set up a dry oatmeal sensory bin with some toys and play and scoops, and then maybe set up a sensory bin with some cooked oatmeal and just kind of explore without that pressure to eat. Once we start putting that pressure on a child, especially a child with very picky eating habits, we'll see them push back even more. So we want it to be a calm environment. We want to make sure we're looking at the environment of the meal table and just the meal in general. Does the child have foot support in their chair or their high chair? Do they have a regulated nervous system to even come to the table? Do we need to do an obstacle course before a meal? What else do you think? Touch on it all?
No,
talk a little bit more about the regulated nervous system before the meal and the obstacle course you just mentioned. That's fascinating.
Yeah. So oftentimes these kiddos are coming to the table and they're completely disorganized because they had to transition away from their blocks and we didn't give them enough time to transition. So we maybe put a visual timer on and we crawl through a tunnel and then we jump on the couch 5 times and then we wheelbarrow walk all the way to the table. And so that kind of gets that nervous system some proprioceptive input, which can be helpful to organize them before they come to the table. So just some fun, frog hop to the table or set the visual timer. And once the timer goes off, then they're going to do a bear crawl around the table 5 times, and then they'll get in their chair. So it's just fun, engaging ways to bring them to the table. It's, again, low pressure, but they're getting that sensory input that helps them feel a little bit more organized.
I love that so much because it's something that we always teach in peaceful parenting. Like when you've got that transition time, we always say you want to find a win-win solution. And, kids never want to stop playing to come to the table. So how can you use play to get them to the table, which sounds like the same thing that you're talking about, but just for a different reason, but they both complement each other. I love it.
Yeah, you want to make it fun and inviting, and using the visual timer, like Rachel said, is a great strategy, but also even using a visual schedule for the daily routine activities if possible. So the child knows that they're going to be playing with their blocks, then they're going to do their obstacle course, then they're going to sit down for lunch, so that they can they can kind of see into the future and know what's coming. And oftentimes kiddos, because they don't know what's coming next, they get anxious and they resist that transition. But if they know what's coming, they know when it's happening, then they're more likely to have that transition be easier.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And also I want to go back to what you said about the, setting up the oatmeal with the toys and stuff. So it strikes me that grandparents are wrong when they say, don't play with your food.
Completely bad advice. Don't listen to it. Play with your food.
Yeah. Somebody a friend of mine who does picky eating stuff, she said, which I think is really helpful to remember, that actually eating the food is the last step.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We lick, we bite, we kiss, we touch, we poke, we thread, with spaghetti noodles. We engage with the food in so many different ways before we even ask them to take a bite.
Yep. Well, and I was listening to a podcast a while ago, and I don't remember what culture they were talking about, but there's a couple of different cultures in Europe where they barely even use silverware. Like they
Mhm.
eat with their hands more often than they use silverware. And it's a very sensory experience when they're eating. And it just reminded me that, our culture is so use your napkin and use your silverware and don't
Don't
touch
get
the food, don't
messy.
get messy. I'm like, that's so opposite of what we want. We want these kids to get messy and have that tactile experience because it helps their body and their brain learn how to process that input and provide that adaptive response.
So tell me more about the adaptive response. Are you talking about that their nervous system and their like sensory input can actually change over time?
Yes. So when we say adaptive response, let's go back to my example of the sound, right? So if the multiple sounds are coming in and I'm feeling dysregulated, I'm not having an appropriate adaptive response. I'm
Because
having
you're like going into fight or flight.
exactly. But an adaptive response would look like all of this noise is coming in. I'm able to stay cool, calm, and collected. I'm able to have a conversation. I'm able to keep my nervous system regulated. I'm having an adaptive response to all of the auditory input that's coming in. An adaptive response for a kid who's eating their food. They can tolerate the different textures in their mouth. They can chew. They can wipe their face. They can, you know, handle that input efficiently. That's that adaptive response. But like you mentioned, can your sensory needs change? Absolutely. They can change from hour to hour, day by day. They can change week by week. They can change when you hit puberty, when you go through pregnancy.
When you experience trauma.
Yes, it's a constantly ever evolving door of sensory processing. It's really difficult, and that's what makes our job unique.
Well, and that's where occupational therapy, specifically sensory integration therapy, comes into play. Is that's our job, is to provide these sensory experiences for the client that we're working with in order to help teach their brain and body how to have that adaptive response. That's really the goal with sensory integration. And so you asked the question, like, how does a parent know if their child should go to OT? And I think the answer is if their challenges are significantly impacting their ability to get through their day, that's when you want to talk to your pediatrician and ask for an OT evaluation. So that's where like sensory processing disorder versus what we call sensory quirks comes in.
Mhm.
So, I like to use my son as an example. My 9-year-old, he's an oral seeker. He will chew on everything. So we constantly have gum available for him so that he can get that oral motor input, because if he's able to use that strategy, it's not negatively impacting his ability to get through his day.
Right,
So
he's not like chewing on his sleeves and like, ragged
yep,
and wet and all of that.
yep.
Yeah.
But if that were the case, and even if like our gum strategy wasn't helpful for him, that would be where I would want to look into OT services for him, because it could be potentially negatively affecting his day.
Mhm. So you look at how much it impacts their day-to-day life and the parents' day-to-day life too, I guess, if the
Yes.
challenges are over. My sister has a newly turned 6-year-old, and for years they've had trouble getting dressed in the morning because
Mhm.
these don't, there's like one or two things that feel right to her. And it's also confusing because it can shift from day to day. I think,
Mhm.
my theory is that when she has higher resources, she's rested and not having a growth spurt or whatever, she can tolerate a little bit more for clothing than when she's maybe tired or sick or something.
Mhm. Yep,
Yes.
100%.
I mean, even for me, if I get a crappy night of sleep, I'm more likely to have a short temper or less
Hmm.
focus during the day. And the
Mhm.
same is true for our kids. If they didn't get a restful night of sleep, if they are hungry, thirsty, dehydrated, constipated, if they're
Mhm.
not eating enough and getting enough nutrients for the day, that is going to affect their ability to process the world around them.
Yeah. I also have heard that when you are under stress or low resources, you also have a lower tolerance for pain. So it
Mhm.
seems like it must be all of your senses just kind of get heightened when you have
Yeah.
lower resources.
And that's
Yes.
definitely connected to that interoceptive system. Your ability to manage pain and be aware of pain is through your interoceptive system. So if that's suppressed, if you're in that fight or flight response, that's going to definitely have an impact.
let's talk about the sensory diet a little bit more. I know there are some of our families who do have access to an OT or to that kind of support. And there's also lots of families who don't have the ability to access that. So are there some sort of DIY ways that you can look at, what your child might be needing and how to provide that appropriate sensory diet for them?
Yeah, it's a thin line we have to make sure that we're being cautious with, because if we, kind of do some of the wrong activities out of order, and we'll talk about this, you can almost make some things worse.
Mm-hmm.
So I think really the most important thing is to complete a checklist, identify the child's sensory preferences. Sensational Brain has a great one that we always use. It's just a quick explanation of, are you under responsive, over responsive, or are you sensory seeking to the different senses? From there, you can identify what input they need more of and what input they kind of need less of. And so you can provide them with, a jumping activity followed by a crawling activity, followed by a visual activity. And you can kind of sequence these activities in a specific order in order to help them feel more regulated, feel more focused, get ready for challenging tasks and transition.
And the order of operations is always the first step is to meet their sensory threshold. And so what that means is we want to meet their sensory needs first. So if your child is always moving, always jumping and running, they're seeking out a combination of vestibular and proprioceptive input with that. So we want to make sure that we do that at the beginning of the sensory diet, because when we provide them with that input that they're seeking, we're meeting their sensory needs. We're meeting their threshold of what they are seeking. And then after you've met their sensory threshold, then you can go into the more calming, slower, more focused activities of the sensory diet to then help their nervous system regulate.
Yeah. So sort of meet them where they're at first before you have any challenges.
Yes.
It's that feeling of like satisfying the hunger, right? That I was
Mm-hmm.
talking about earlier. You have to give them, feed that hunger, make sure that they're not starving, give them that input that they're craving, and then kind of transition into more of that calming, proprioceptive based, more function based activities.
Because what we'll run into is we'll run into families, parents saying, I need a sensory diet for my kid before bed because they're so dysregulated before they go to bed. And we'll say, okay, first let's meet their sensory needs, because what they've been doing instead is they try to just calm their child down at bedtime. They just do all the calming activities at bedtime, and then their child is still dysregulated. And it's just because they didn't meet their child's sensory needs. They need to do those more movement based, sometimes more vestibular based activities first, maybe an hour before bed. You spend 10, 15 minutes meeting those sensory needs before you do the calming activities to help them come back down.
That is so cool, because there's another spot where we overlap, because I always recommend to parents, like, do some roughhousing before bed.
Yes.
And we talk about it to help them empty their emotional backpacks, like to relieve like the stresses and tensions from the day. And parents are always like, what do you mean? Wind them up before they go to bed? I'm like, no. In my experience, most kids go to bed way better when you get some of that roughhousing, and maybe not right before bed, but in the evening.
And most kids are intuitive with what they need. My son, he wants to ride bulls, and we'll take turns like being the bull, and he'll ride and fall off and crash, and we'll throw them on the beanbag chair and on the couch, and they crave that. They initiate that generally. If they're off of screens and they're feeling comfortable, they'll probably initiate that. We just need to make sure we do it in kind of that organized fashion of providing them with that rough housing, and then doing like a slow, I like to do the turtle crawl, putting like a weighted blanket or a pillow on their back, and they have to crawl slowly from point A to point B and then repeat. So they get that high input, that high energy input, and then they have to slow their nervous system down. So kind of alternating between the two can be really helpful.
And
I
it's
love
so
that.
funny because, well, I was just going to say, my 9-year-old every single night says, can we wrestle? Can we wrestle before bed?
I love that.
And I always just have to remind myself, like, yes, we can wrestle.
He'll go to bed better if you wrestle with him. He'll go to bed better.
Yes.
My boys, when they were little, we did this thing where they would, I don't know how we started doing it, but they would show us their skills before bed. And I always think of it skills like with a Z on the end, like, and they would do like jumps and kicks and like, watch this and twists. And we'd sit on the couch and just, so I don't know, maybe you could, if you don't feel like wrestling, maybe you could get your son to like show you some stuff so you can chill out.
Yes.
So I was just going to say also, what you just said something, Rachel, about noticing your child, because they often know what they need. And I hear that a lot from parents too. Like when you start looking into this, like, oh, well, no wonder, they always feel better when I give them a hug, or I mean, that's kind of an obvious one, but that's providing the proprioceptive input, like a deep hug, right? And so I think sometimes if they just notice, you can just notice like the things that make your kid feel better or more dysregulated and do more of the regulating stuff. They already probably know some of these things.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it's so helpful too to just kind of keep like a quick journal of what you're noticing for a couple of days. In the morning, what is your child craving? What are they avoiding? What are they seeking out? What type of input? Just see if you can keep a bit of a journal, and then you can identify what you can give them more of. So if they're bouncing off the walls at 6 o'clock in the morning, okay, we need to maybe provide them with like a structured obstacle course. And yes, it takes a lot of work up front from the parents. It's exhausting, but you can kind of set it up and teach them to go through these obstacle courses to meet their needs. And once you have an idea of, throughout the day, what they're seeking, what they're avoiding, you can kind of tailor your activities. If you're home with your young children, you can tailor your activities to what they need. If your child's coming home from school and they're completely dysregulated, that's another thing that we'll see often is a child will hold it together all day at school, get home to their comfort place, and just let it all out. And so when that happens, we like to give them their space, not ask them a bunch of questions, give them time to decompress, and then go outside, get some fresh air, do an obstacle course, ride bikes, get some proprioceptive input that's very child-led. And then, making sure that there's a snack in there, but making sure that you are talking about their day during dinner time, or giving them time to kind of decompress before you're hammering them with, how was your day? What'd you do? What'd you learn? How was it?
Yeah.
That's always something that you and Logan do. You have a great example of that.
Yeah. Well, there was a time a couple years ago where, I'd pick him up from school and I'd immediately ask him, hey, how was your day? And he was like, oh, it's fine. And you could just tell that he didn't want to talk about it. So now when he comes home from school, well, now he lives close enough to his school that he often just rides his bike to and from. So that's kind of his decompression period, is riding his bike home from school. But even then, when he gets home, I will let him lead the conversation. So I'll just be like, hi, happy you're home. It's good to see you, just let him know that. And then he gets a snack, he gets some water, and then I will wait and see what kind of conversation he wants to have.
I love that. Yeah, I learned early on in my relationship with my husband that he's not one for like a big greeting at the door and a hug and how was your day? He like really needs 5 or 10 minutes of nobody talking to him before he feels like talking to any of us.
Yeah. And that's so important to be able to regulate. This is very important for spouses too. Like spouses and partners, like you should be taking notes, because this is very important too.
Yes.
Totally. So if you do have a kiddo who has, the trouble with, okay, let's just talk about my niece with the trouble of getting dressed, because I know that's a super common one. Do you have any tips for parents who do have struggles with the getting dressed thing? We've talked about so many of the great parts of the day so far. I think that may be one that would be helpful to touch on a bit.
I think if you can identify the certain types of clothing that they will wear, try to get more of those first, right? Provide them with those they feel safe options of clothing so they can get dressed. But then you want to address that tactile system. If it is because they can't tolerate certain textures or the tags or the seams, then you want to do more activities that target tactile processing. So messy sensory bins are a really great option. Oftentimes these kiddos don't like to get their hands messy. So doing some dry sensory bins with rice or beans to start, and then progressing to things like maybe Orbeez, like those water beads, or shaving cream, or messy food play, and incorporating those into the daily routine, and incorporate them into obstacle courses so they're more fun, right? So maybe they have some tunnels and some cushions to crash on, and they can do an activity with the sensory bin, and then they crawl through the tunnel and crash. So they're getting that tactile input that maybe they struggle to process, followed by proprioceptive input to help calm that nervous system that might be starting to get dysregulated from the tactile input.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then going along with that, you can also provide vibration. So you can grab one of those vibrating massage balls and rub that all over their body and let them be in control of that.
Mm-hmm.
Then you can also do like some brushing of the skin with deep pressure, like using a dry washcloth, or let them do that in the in the bath as well. In therapy, we'll often use like a surgical brush called the deep pressure brushing protocol. And that one we want to be cautious with just because we want to make sure that we're doing it in the right order and we just want to make sure that we're getting trained properly before we
Yeah, that's
start.
not a try this one at home.
Exactly. Exactly.
But the other stuff that you've said all is like and a lot of this is through play, right?
Oh,
Like
yes.
a lot of things you can really do all of this through play with your child.
Yes.
Yeah.
You could even do these activities before your child gets dressed, especially like the vibrating ball that Rachel mentioned. That's a great one to do before your child gets dressed. So then they're almost desensitized a little bit and they could potentially tolerate the clothing a little bit easier. But the trick here too is to do it a couple of times throughout the day, not just one and done, right? Because that effect wears off at a certain point. Everyone's different when that will happen, but being sure that you're doing these sensory activities throughout the day.
Yeah, and remember that the proprioceptive system is the all calming, all grounding sense. So if you're struggling with this oversensitivity to tactile input, you're not getting dressed, incorporating more heavy work before you're getting dressed as well, or after can be helpful too.
Or both.
Yep,
Yeah.
doing animal walks, doing big hugs, doing wall push-ups, doing log rolls, crawling, anything that we're providing that compression or stretching to the joints and muscles and tendons is going to be very organizing to the nervous system and kind of counteract that sensitivity too.
I love that. I really like over the years, especially most recently, learning a lot about the nervous system, really come to understand temperament as more of just like a nervous system thing, right?
Yeah.
Like you think about kids who are spirited and they're like always running and jumping. I think, as you mentioned, they're looking for that sensory input, right? Or those kids who are like really calm and just like want to sit and listen to stories. Like that's because they're maybe, I wouldn't go as far as to say sensory avoidant, but their nervous system is better regulated with less sensory input. So it's all of this strikes me as just like our nervous systems and our brains looking for what it needs to feel regulated.
Exactly.
Yes.
So cool. Well, this has been so interesting for me personally and professionally, and I know it has going to be really helpful for a lot of parents. I just want to stress one thing that I kind of wish we'd said earlier, but this is not like a choice that your child is making. Can you just maybe talk about that a little bit? Because I think sometimes parents really feel like, why are they doing this to me? Like, why can't they just, do this thing that we do every day?
Yeah, we always say kids will do well if they can. They need to be safe and comfortable in their own skin, in their surroundings, in order to really thrive and do their best. And I think it's important to remember that, even not to project our bad days on our kids. Like if we're having a hard time, it's not because of our children or because our kids can't do this or are struggling to do that. It's very much we need to be the safe, calm. We need to co-regulate with our kiddos. That goes hand in hand with sensory processing. If we're in fight or flight, our children are probably going to be in fight or flight as well. So we need to make sure that we remember that we need to give them the tools in order to help them do the best that they can, because they're not malicious. It might seem like they are sometimes, but they really aren't.
Yeah. They want to be, quote, good. That's what I always say. Like no kid wants to be bad. Not that there are any bad kids, but all right. So before I let you go, two more quick things. Well, I don't know about quick, but one is tell us about the best places to find where we'll put these links in the show notes too, but tell folks how to find out more about you and what you do. Best places to find you online.
Well, make sure you listen to our podcast. It's All Things Sensory by Harkla. And we have episodes on everything that we chatted about today, plus more. We also have episodes on helping parents, like adults, feel more regulated, because we as adults also become overstimulated and dysregulated. So that's helpful for parents a lot of times, I think, as well.
Yep. So listen to our podcast. I would say is step one. We do offer mentoring sessions. So they're kind of like what we did today, just in person, kind of like virtually. We kind of get an idea of what you're struggling with, and then we just brainstorm with you and give you some strategies. If you need a sensory diet, then we can help you kind of put something like that together.
It's not occupational therapy services.
No.
It's more of just like what it is
Coaching.
meant to be.
Yes.
Coaching.
Just
Yes.
mentoring, just here to help you and give you some strategies. It shouldn't be a replacement for therapy, but it is a good way of helping you identify if you need therapy. I can recommend that and say, let's go that route. Let's get in-person services.
And where do folks find that link to more
That
about
is
that?
on harkla.co, and we can
Okay.
send you a link to share as well, a direct link. But that's a great resource. And then we have courses available.
We have a YouTube channel, the Harkla YouTube channel.
Okay, great. All
And
right,
then
we'll link to all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I mean, there's just so much overlap with, generally people with easy kids don't go listening to parenting podcasts and look for parenting help because they don't need it. But it's the people who have the kids who are like what we call more or extra kids, you usually have something going on where parents need more support and more information and more strategies. So I really appreciate this. My final question that I would love for each of you to answer is, this is something I ask all my guests. If you were to go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
Oh, no.
I mean, I already am a pretty new parent, but
Right. Well, if you were to go back 2.5 years ago, what do you wish you knew then?
I would say it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. You're going to make it through. Things will change. It's a season. That's like my mantra. But, even on the hard days, you're always going to make it through. That's just like what I need to tell myself, what I need to tell anyone else who's struggling, friends who are in the same season. It's going to be fine.
It's going to be
totally
fine.
Channeling my inner
through this. Yeah. Great.
Mine would be to just follow my kids' lead more, right? I do that really well now and even just in the last couple of years, but in the beginning, I don't think I did it as much. I think that I tried to lead him more and I would tell him what to do versus me asking him questions or following his lead with what he wanted to play with or, those kinds of things. And so I think that would be mine. Just follow the child's lead, see what they're interested in. Even if you're not interested in it, pretend like you're interested in it because it does help build their confidence.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really have enjoyed our conversation, and I know that it's going to be really helpful for parents. So thank you.
Yeah,
thank you for having us.
We appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. I hope you found this conversation insightful and exactly what you needed in this moment. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Remember that I'm rooting for you. I see you out there showing up for your kids and doing the best you can. Sending hugs over the airwaves today. Hang in there. You've got this.